Over the last few weeks, I've been presented with a number of different themes which have really got me thinking about how we represent Jesus in the art of the liturgy, something which is obviously of particular importance for me as a liturgical artist, as a painter of icons. What sort of precipitated this response was a post that was put up by Father Gregory Hallam, who is an Orthodox priest in Manchester, and he put up this picture. Now, in this image, you can see the Virgin Mary depicted as a Japanese woman holding Jesus dressed as a Japanese child, and they have Japanese racial features. And Father Gregory was putting this up as an example of religious art which wouldn't be acceptable for the Orthodox, especially within the church. And he put up a challenge to me as what response I would make to his assertion that the depiction of Jesus as a white male is something which came out of the Renaissance and is something very much from the Western church, and my reflections on that. So that was the catalyst really for these reflections. But in the background is a discussion that I had with some of my friends who are other iconographers about what we do in the light of Black Lives Matters and the way in which we can represent Jesus in our art in a way which is both authentically iconographic but also something which takes on board the sensitivities and insights of our own contemporary context. So I've been thinking about some of these issues, and I thought I'd do a little reflection to try and bring all these things together. So I'd like to begin with an Orthodox image of the Virgin Mary. Now, as you can see, there is Vladimir Putin, defender of Holy Russia, and he's visiting the mosaics which are destined for the new cathedral of the Russian military, which has just been consecrated by the Russian Orthodox Patriarch. You can't get any more absolute Orthodox than that. And he's here visiting the mosaics before they were installed. And lo and behold, the Virgin Mary is incredibly white, even Slavic, with those high cheekbones. She's definitely not Middle Eastern. She's very much engaging you as a real life person. Yet she is dressed as you would expect within an icon. It's destined for one of the great sanctuaries of contemporary Russian church life. So when we start talking about the introduction of and the place of ethnically nuanced images of Jesus and the Virgin Mary, it's not a Western problem. This is something which is found across the churches, and Orthodoxy is up to its neck in this as much as anybody else. So that's the first thing I'd like to put out there, that we've got to be really careful that we don't get into an argument between East and West, because Orthodoxy in the East is right and everything that's sort of corrupt has come from the West. I don't think that is borne out by an examination of the historical records, and it's certainly not borne out by a sensitive observation of what's around us today, as this particular image shows you. So it does seem to me that even within contemporary Orthodoxy, you have room for quite a variety of ways in which you can represent Jesus and the saints within the liturgical context. Let me show you another example here. Now, this is a Russian icon, obviously several hundred years old, and it's depicting Jesus as the blessed silence. Now, the Russians have gone in for what you might call theological icons, where they seek to express with a sort of visual language some of the sort of mystical teachings about Christ and the church. And this is a particular example. Now, as you can see, that face is a very enigmatic sort of face. Jesus doesn't have a beard, for example. He is represented as an angel in an angelic form. And angels don't have beards in iconography or in the tradition. So you have something here which is, well, it's not Jesus as he was known in history in Judea. To be fair, it's quite a dark face. Presumably that's not just a result of age and varnish. And within iconography in general, medieval iconography especially, the faces do tend to be quite dark. But, having said that, with this sort of range of representation. Let's look at another one now. Now, this is a Greek icon of Jesus, and you can tell it's Jesus, one, because it's got the cross in the halo, and also because it's inscribed, Jesus Christos. Now, this is Jesus as the Ancient of Days. So, again, an innovation in terms of iconographic styles and canons. Certainly, this sort of representation wasn't found in the earliest period and has sort of entered into the tradition at some point by an innovation. And Jesus is shown here in a way that's not instantly recognizable. You have to really look and say, oh, who is that? And then you look at the halo and read the inscription and say, oh, that's who it is. So you can't really argue that the canons of iconography say Jesus has to be painted in one very specific way, be that in terms of whether he's got a beard or not, whether he's shown as young or old, whether he's shown as a person in a particular time, in a particular place, with a particular ethnicity, or whether he can be represented in a more universalistic way. So, for example, as the Ancient of Days, or as divine wisdom, or so on. So orthodoxy and the tradition of iconography seems to have a lot of flexibility in it, and we should not be trapped into a sort of narrow definition of canonicity. Now, I'd like to now look at a very old icon, this one, from Rome, one of the earliest icons of the Virgin Mary, which has been venerated in Rome since the 6th century. And this is the restored version. It's been restored recently. And you can see here Mary is really very much a white woman. And she's holding a white child. But it's not a skin colour. It's more a sort of luminosity. It's more a figure of light. And in fact, when you look at the shadows, those deep greens on the side of the face, you don't get the feeling that you're looking here at a Caucasian face. There's something enigmatic. It's not Caucasian, but at the same time it's not a Middle Eastern or Arabic or Mediterranean face with an olive look to it. This really is a figure of light. I think that's important. Now, what's very interesting, if we compare this with this modern version by a Russian iconographer who currently is in Dallas in Texas, and it's his version of that original. Now, here you have got much more of a Caucasian Mary and Jesus. This is not Jesus the Jew. It's not Jesus the Middle Eastern. It's not Jesus from the Mediterranean with his olive skin. So we're not dealing here with a Jesus of history or the Virgin Mary of history, but we're instead dealing with a culturally appropriated, incarnated version of Jesus and Mary. So what I want to say is that within contemporary orthodoxy and within historical orthodoxy, and indeed the history of the whole church, East and West, from the earliest times, there seems to be a great deal of lateral movement for ensuring that the images that are painted resonate with the people who are seeing them. It's maybe not done for an ideological purpose, to say Jesus is, doesn't belong to one race or another, though that could be part of it. But I think this is much more about the art nestling into its cultural context and taking on the characteristics of the people where the liturgy is being celebrated. And that's a natural osmosis. As an artist, you paint in a situation. You are looking at faces all the time that have a particular hue or particular characteristics, and that reflects itself in the way in which you paint. So I would like to suggest that we should re-examine the tradition with much more openness towards the variety of creativity and sensitivity that is being expressed there. Now, I want to now push this a little bit. Those examples have shown you images that we're used to. Yeah, Jesus is Middle Eastern, or Jesus as a white person, or Mary as a white lady, is something that is familiar to us. So we don't feel a sort of jar, because it's part and parcel of the backdrop of all religious art that you find in any church. And that, unfortunately, also includes missionary situations, Africa, Asia, South America, and so forth, where there is a dissonance rather than a resonance with these images and the people who are gathering there to celebrate the Mass. So, pushing forward, I want to now look at this image. Now, this is again from Rome. This is from around 525 AD, and in the Church of St. Cosmas and Damian. And here is Christ, definitely black. Now, why do I say definitely black? Well, if we compare that with this one, is much clearer. If we compare the way in which these figures of Peter and Paul in the same mosaic are portrayed, you can see that here Peter is definitely a white person. Here Paul is not as white as Peter. These other two martyrs are definitely darker folk, and one would maybe suggest North Africa. But when you actually then come to Jesus, his skin colour and its tones, especially compared to Peter, is definitely dark and black. That is a man of colour. Maybe not African, but maybe Indian, maybe Aboriginal, but there is definitely a man of colour, and we recognise it instantly as Christ, even though, notice, within the halo there is not the cross, and we don't have that inscription. So whereas that image of Christ, which I had to point out, well, is the Ancient of Days, it is actually Jesus, because you can see the halo, the cross in the halo, and you can read the Jesus Christos. So it wasn't recognizable instantly. This image is recognizably Jesus. And we can engage with that in a way that is resonant. It rests in our visual understanding. So rather than being a block, it's actually a door that opens to the realities that are being represented here. And I think this is really, really important, because iconography is there to serve a purpose. It's not an end in itself. It's not there to be interesting. It's not there to make a political statement. Art does that, and it's a very important medium for doing that. But its primary purpose is to resonate on earth with the things of heaven, so that when you're in the liturgy, you're able to just pray with your eyes. It's something that just sort of happens, not something you have to sort of switch into or become terribly self-conscious about. It's the theology of the church in paint, hymns in paint, if you like. And so the importance of canonical art within the liturgy is that the images conform to the dogmas of the church councils. And this has always been the fundamental understanding of what iconography is, rather than just religious art. It's not about expressing what I as an artist feel or think. That's why we don't put our name on it. It's about expressing simply the truths of the church, especially as defined in the ecumenical councils. So for me, reflecting on these images and what we find in the tradition, I think this idea of resonance and dissonance is the key. If the image settles in its context in a way that draws people in, then that's authentic. But if it's something that draws attention to itself because it's trying to make a point, a political point, then it's failing in its purpose. It's become an end in itself. And the icon is always brutally honest that it's not the realities being represented, but it's the door through which those realities meet the beholder. It fades away. It's like John the Baptist. I must decrease so that he may increase. This is the authenticity of any art of the liturgy, whatever style it's in, whatever artistic notes it uses. If it just ends up vanishing because you're enwrapped with the realities it's presenting, then this is good iconographic art. Now, another article that was brought to my attention by a friend of mine was looking at the art of a contemporary Greek Orthodox iconographer, Scleriris, if I got his name correct. And this is an example of one of his icons. Now, his icons are painted on church walls. They're vast, massive pieces, not just little devotional pieces. He is a Greek Orthodox priest, and he is painting art as a faithful Greek Orthodox. And for him, this is the living tradition, and it's authentic because it's about the church painting in its contemporary context. And it can't do that authentically without listening to the art that's going on around it. And so therefore what you see in his art, in his icons, is something that's very much influenced by, talking to, caressed by modern artistic movements. And that includes, therefore, what their purpose is and what they're trying to say. And part of that is about what the artist sees. It's about innovation. It's about pushing boundaries. It's about being innovative. It's about provoking a reaction. It's about art as encounter. And for me, this style of art in iconography is beginning to jar. Rather than a resonance, it's a dissonance. Now, I'm not saying that it's not great art and that this isn't a really talented, faithful Christian artist. But my concern is that what he's doing is expressing art as it is in the contemporary world. And because of what that philosophy is, by its nature, it's about dissonance rather than about resonance. And I would point, for example, in this icon to the use of colour, which is really quite gaudy. And if you look at some of the stylizations of the faces and so forth around the Virgin Child, there's something cartoon-like, and it seems to be moving away from something that's really connecting with the humanity as it was lived and becoming something of a symbol of it rather than a manifestation of it in a more direct way. Now, I want to just finally contrast this with another painting, contemporary painting, by an American priest. And as you can see in here, he has rooted his iconography deep within the particular culture where he serves as a priest, which is Native American culture, First Nation culture. And he's done it with tremendous empathy for that culture, but also for the iconographic tradition as it's been passed down as a living means of opening the door of Christ into our world. You look at that and you know that is the Transfiguration. The arrangement, the mandala, the way in which Christ is larger, it's got that hierarchy perspective over the two prophet figures. It speaks, it resonates, even though I am coming to this as somebody who has very little sense of American native culture. I am not feeling offended by the means, the route that he is taking. I'm sort of coming alongside on the same road, on the same journey. And I feel comfortable enough with this. It's outside of the cultural reference, so I can't really resonate with it in its particular culture. If I was a Native American, I might find this very offensive. I don't know. That's not my context. But as an iconographer, the sensitivity in the way this is presented resonates deep within my tradition. And the sensitivity, for example, of the use of colours, the harmony that those colours are presenting, but at the same time the vibrancy, there's a sort of asceticism in the way in which he is using colour and form. He's not going for hyper-realism. He's not drawing you to his cleverness as an artist. The art, as it were, is the clothes around the skeleton of the presence of Christ, so that that presence can be made known. So while I am, as I say, some unease about this, because I just don't know how that works within a particular culture, but from the perspective of the enduring tradition, comparing that with other images in the tradition, like, for example, that Greek one of Christ the Ancient of Days, or the Russian one of Christ that Angel of Silence. This is certainly within that sort of latitude. And I think there is something here which is authentic. Thank you for listening.